Everybody knows Heart Evangelista for luxury fashion, designer bags, and a lifestyle that looks straight out of Beverly Hills. But far away from the cameras and red carpets, there's another side of Heart that most people have never seen. Hidden in the cool mountains of Tagaytay is a stunning private estate so massive, so exclusive, and so luxurious that it barely feels real. From resort-style views to ultra-elegant interiors, this place is on a completely different level. And in this video, we're taking you inside. The luxury empire Heart built in silence. Before the red carpets, before the front rows in Paris Fashion Week, and before the world began associating her name with high fashion and elite luxury circles, Heart Evangelista was already shaping something far more deliberate than fame. An identity built on control, elegance, and quiet influence. Because in her world, nothing has ever been random. At first glance, she fits the global image of a modern luxury socialite. Always composed, always visually refined, always positioned exactly where attention naturally gathers. Whether she is attending international fashion events, collaborating with global luxury brands, or appearing in curated public moments, she doesn't just participate in luxury culture. She blends into it as if she was designed for it. But what separates her from many public figures is not just access to luxury. It is how she interacts with it. Heart Evangelista does not rely on constant exposure to stay relevant. Instead, she operates through selective visibility. Her appearances feel intentional, almost like carefully released chapters of a larger story. She doesn't overwhelm the public with noise or constant updates. Instead, she allows space for curiosity, interpretation, and speculation. And in the world of modern celebrity culture, that kind of restraint is powerful, because attention is easy to lose when it is overused. But mystery, when managed properly, creates longevity, and Heart has mastered that balance in a way few others have. Her influence in fashion alone already tells part of the story. She is not simply a celebrity wearing designer pieces. She has become a reference point within luxury branding itself. Designers associate her with their identity. Luxury houses align their campaigns with her aesthetic. Her presence in a space elevates its perceived exclusivity, not because she demands attention, but because she naturally embodies refinement. And that refinement did not happen overnight. It was built gradually over years of consistent public evolution, from television actress to fashion figure to international style personality. Each phase of her career added another layer to her identity, until what the public sees today became a fully formed image of controlled luxury. A life that appears effortless on the surface, but is deeply structured underneath. What makes this even more interesting is her approach to privacy. In an era where most celebrities document nearly every moment of their lives, Heart moves differently. She shares, but never too much. She reveals, but always selectively. Even her most personal moments are presented through an aesthetic lens, as if every image is part of a curated archive rather than a spontaneous snapshot. This creates a psychological gap between her and the audience. People feel like they know her but not fully. They see her life but not entirely. And that gap is where fascination grows. Because the less people know, the more they want to understand. Over time, this controlled visibility has become one of her strongest assets. She exists in a rare space where she is constantly seen, yet never completely exposed. And that balance allows her to maintain relevance without exhausting her public identity. But beyond fashion, branding, and curated appearances, there is another consistent pattern in her lifestyle that stands out: movement toward calmness. While much of her public life is tied to high-energy environments, fashion shows, social events, brand collaborations, her personal rhythm often shifts in the opposite direction. Away from noise, away from crowds, away from constant attention. And this contrast is not accidental. It suggests something deeper about how she navigates life at this level of visibility. Because when your public identity is built on exposure, your private identity often becomes about protection. Protection of time, protection of space, protection of mental and emotional balance. This is where a quieter pattern begins to emerge. Short retreats, sudden breaks, moments away from the intensity of city life. Not in a way that feels dramatic or attention-seeking, but in a way that feels intentional and necessary. A consistent return to environments that are calmer, cooler, and more detached from the pace of Manila's entertainment and fashion scene. And one place keeps appearing more than others: Tagaytay. At first, it seemed like nothing unusual. Tagaytay is a known escape for many people, celebrated for its cool climate, scenic views, and distance from the city's chaos. But in Heart's case, the repetition begins to draw attention. Because it is not just about visiting, it is about returning. And repeated patterns in lifestyle often reveal more than public statements ever could. Because when someone already immersed in luxury chooses to repeatedly step into quieter, elevated environments, it raises a subtle but important question. Is it just preference, or is it part of something deeper? At this stage, the public-facing version of her life already feels complete: fashion, influence, elegance, and global recognition. But the private side, the side that exists away from cameras and curated events, feels intentionally less visible. And that is where curiosity begins to grow. Because if this is the version of her life that the world gets to see, then what exists in the spaces she chooses to step away into? That question doesn't just lead to speculation, it leads somewhere else entirely. Tagaytay, Heart's ultimate escape. For someone like Heart Evangelista, every part of life is usually connected to visibility. Cameras, events, fashion weeks, social gatherings, her world is built on being seen. So when a pattern starts forming where she consistently moves away from that environment, people naturally begin to pay attention. And that pattern leads to one place more than any other: Tagaytay. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Tagaytay has always been a popular escape for anyone living in or around Metro Manila. It's close enough for a quick drive, yet far enough to feel like a different world entirely. The air is cooler, the pace is slower, and the noise of the city feels like it disappears the moment you start ascending its winding roads. But for someone operating at Heart's level of fame and exposure, Tagaytay is not just a weekend destination. It becomes something else entirely: a controlled environment where the rules of public life feel temporarily suspended. Because in the city, everything demands performance. There are expectations, appearances, obligations, and constant attention. Even simple movements are observed, photographed, and interpreted. But in Tagaytay, that pressure loosens. Space expands. Time feels less compressed. And for public figures, that shift can be more valuable than luxury itself. That contrast is where the real appeal begins. Heart's public life thrives in structured chaos: fashion shows, media obligations, and international appearances where every detail is curated and controlled. But that same structure can become exhausting when it never stops. And that is where places like Tagaytay become more than scenery. They become relief. What makes Tagaytay particularly interesting in her story is not just that she visits, it's the consistency of it. Over time, fans and observers began noticing how often she appeared in environments tied to the area. Sometimes it's quiet moments shared on social media. Other times, its subtle background settings suggest distance from the city. Nothing overt, nothing officially announced, but enough to build curiosity. And curiosity, in her case, always grows into speculation. Because celebrities don't just travel randomly in the public imagination, every location becomes part of a narrative. Every repeated destination becomes a question mark. And Tagaytay, with its privacy-friendly atmosphere and luxury properties hidden behind trees and gates, naturally fuels that curiosity even more. There is also something symbolic about Tagaytay itself. It sits above the city, literally elevated. Looking down over the chaos of Metro Manila, it feels detached, almost observational. That alone makes it attractive to people who live constantly under pressure. It offers not just comfort, but perspective. A reminder that distance can be a form of control. And control is something that seems to define much of Heart's life. She doesn't move reactively in public spaces. She moves selectively. Even her breaks from the spotlight feel measured rather than impulsive. There is a rhythm to her presence and absence that suggests intention, not randomness. And Tagaytay fits neatly into that rhythm. It becomes a pause button. A place where the intensity of fame can temporarily soften without completely disappearing. But there's another layer to this that people rarely talk about. Tagaytay is not just scenic. It is also private. Many high-profile individuals are drawn to it precisely because it allows visibility without exposure. Large properties are hidden behind natural landscapes. Roads wind in ways that limit access, and homes can exist in plain sight while still feeling removed from the public world. That combination of accessibility and isolation is rare. And for someone managing a life as visible as Heart Evangelista's, that balance becomes extremely valuable. Because at a certain level of fame, privacy is no longer just about preference. It becomes about preservation. Preservation of peace. Preservation of relationships. Preservation of identity outside of public expectation. So when people notice repeated connections between her and Tagaytay, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like pattern recognition. Not because anything is officially confirmed or revealed, but because the behavior aligns with a broader lifestyle logic. High visibility in public, controlled withdrawal in private. And that duality is what makes her story so compelling. Because it raises a question that the public is never directly answered. What does her life look like when it is no longer being performed? Tagaytay in this context becomes more than a place. It becomes a symbol of that unanswered question. A space where the version of life that exists outside cameras might quietly unfold. And the more people notice this pattern, the more the curiosity shifts away from her public appearances and toward what might be happening in the spaces in between them. The hidden property fans started noticing. By this point, the curiosity around Heart Evangelista had already shifted into something deeper than casual fan interest. It was no longer just about her fashion, her travels, or her carefully curated public moments. It had become about patterns. Repeated patterns that people online were beginning to piece together like fragments of a puzzle that was never officially presented as a puzzle in the first place. And at the center of that growing curiosity was one location: Tagaytay. At first, it looked harmless. Just a frequent escape route, a familiar destination, a place many celebrities go to unwind. But over time, fans started noticing something different in the way Tagaytay kept appearing in her orbit. Not as a highlighted destination, but as a quiet backdrop that kept resurfacing in subtle, almost unintentional ways. A view in the distance. A landscape that didn't match typical hotel architecture. A sense of space that felt more private than public. Nothing was ever clearly revealed, yet nothing felt entirely random either. And that's where speculation begins to grow. Because the internet has a strange way of turning fragments into narratives. A single frame becomes a theory. A theory becomes a discussion. A discussion becomes a belief system built entirely on observation and interpretation. And in this case, the idea that started forming was simple but powerful. There might be a private property in Tagaytay connected to her lifestyle that has never been openly discussed, not confirmed, not denied, just unspoken. And in celebrity culture, silence often speaks louder than statements. What made this even more intriguing was how carefully controlled her public exposure already was. She is not someone who overshares. Her content is deliberate, aesthetically refined, and often framed in a way that focuses on mood rather than location details. That alone creates space for interpretation. Because when details are limited, imagination fills the gaps. Soon, fans began revisiting old posts, analyzing backgrounds, zooming into frames, comparing angles, and trying to match scenery with known Tagaytay locations. Some pointed out structures partially hidden by trees. Others noted architectural styles that felt more residential than commercial. Nothing was definitive, but the consistency of the speculation kept it alive. And once an idea like that takes hold online, it doesn't disappear easily. It evolves. The conversation slowly shifted from, does she go to Tagaytay often? Why does it feel like there's something there we haven't seen yet? And that shift is important because it changes the nature of curiosity. It moves from observation into suspicion, not in a negative sense, but in a narrative sense. People begin looking for meaning behind what is not being shown. Tagaytay itself plays a role in that perception. It is not just a scenic escape. It is a place built for contrast. Elevated above the city, it offers distance without disconnect, privacy without isolation, luxury without chaos. And for high-profile individuals, that combination is powerful. It allows life to continue, but at a different volume. Quieter, slower, more controlled. That's why the idea of a hidden property there feels believable, even without confirmation. Because the environment itself supports the possibility. And in Heart's case, that possibility becomes even more compelling because of how consistent her need for controlled space appears to be. Her public life is intense by design. Events, fashion weeks, brand partnerships, media visibility. But her personal rhythm suggests balance. Moments of withdrawal, periods of quiet, spaces where attention is not the primary force shaping her environment. And people started noticing that contrast more and more. Every time she stepped back from public appearances, the assumption wasn't just rest, it was location. Where did she go? What kind of environment allows that level of calm? Why does Tagaytay keep appearing in that conversation more than anywhere else? These questions don't come from evidence. They come from repetition. And repetition, in storytelling, creates familiarity. Familiarity creates belief. Even when nothing is officially confirmed, the narrative begins to feel real simply because it keeps reappearing in different forms. What makes this phase of the story particularly interesting is that no one can point to a single defining moment where the idea of a hidden estate was introduced. There was no announcement, no reveal, no clear starting point. It emerged gradually, built from observation, discussion, and interpretation across different spaces online. And that is what makes it so persistent. Because narratives that are not officially defined are the hardest to close. They remain open-ended, always evolving, always subject to reinterpretation. In Heart's case, that open-ended narrative now revolves around Tagaytay, not just as a destination but as a possibility. One that sits quietly at the edge of her already carefully constructed public life. A place that may or may not exist in the way people imagine it, but a place that, in the public mind, has already taken shape. And the more it is discussed, the more inevitable one question becomes. If this hidden space truly exists, what does it actually look like when no one is watching? Because somewhere behind the calm scenery, the winding roads, and the silence of Tagaytay, many believe there is an entirely different side of Heart Evangelista's world waiting to be uncovered. One built not for cameras or public attention, but for peace, privacy, and a lifestyle few people will ever truly experience. Inside the estate that feels like a private resort. By the time the conversation reaches this point, the story surrounding Heart Evangelista is no longer just about fashion, fame, or public appearances. It has shifted into something more grounded in space, privacy, and lifestyle. And at the center of that shift is a Tagaytay estate that reflects a very different side of her world. Quiet, controlled, and deeply intentional. Unlike the fast-paced energy of Manila or the constant visibility of international fashion circuits, this side of her life exists in stillness. In Tagaytay, everything slows down. The air is cooler, the atmosphere softer, and the environment naturally removes the pressure of being constantly seen. That setting alone already defines the tone of what this estate represents. From the outside, the property carries the kind of presence that doesn't need to be loud to feel significant. It is positioned in a way that maximizes privacy, surrounded by natural elevation and greenery that separates it from the noise of the city below. The approach itself feels deliberate, winding roads, gradual ascent, and increasing silence as you move further away from urban life. And once you step into that space, the experience shifts immediately. The first impression is not excess, but balance. Open areas that allow light and air to move freely. Architecture that prioritizes flow over formality. Structures designed not to dominate the landscape, but to exist within it. There is a clear intention behind every element, to create a space where nothing feels rushed or forced. This is not a property built for attention, it is built for presence. Large windows open the interior to the surrounding views of Tagaytay's rolling terrain. Instead of separating the inside from the outside, the design allows both to merge. Morning light enters softly, casting calm tones across the rooms. At sunset, the entire space shifts into warm, muted colors that reflect the horizon beyond. Every corner feels considered. Every space feels usable without being overcrowded. There is a sense of restraint in the design choices, an understanding that true luxury does not require constant display. It requires comfort, clarity, and space to breathe. Outdoors, the estate extends into wide, carefully maintained grounds. Landscaped gardens stretch across sections of the property, not in a rigid or overly structured way, but in a way that feels natural to the environment. Paths move quietly through greenery, connecting different areas without disrupting the sense of openness. There are spaces designed for pause areas where one can sit and simply take in the view of Tagaytay's horizon. From certain points, the landscape opens completely, revealing layers of hills and sky that shift with the weather. It is the kind of view that changes the rhythm of a day without any effort at all. What stands out most about the estate is its atmosphere. It does not feel performative, it does not feel staged. Instead, it feels lived in with intention. A place where privacy is not an afterthought, but the foundation of its design. Inside, the aesthetic continues that same philosophy. Interiors are refined without being overwhelming. Overwhelming. Neutral tones dominate, allowing natural light and surrounding scenery to become part of the design. Furniture and decor are selected not to impress visitors, but to support comfort and calm. There is a quiet elegance in how everything is arranged. Nothing feels excessive. Nothing feels out of place. Instead, there is a consistency that ties every space together. An understated luxury that does not demand attention, but naturally holds it. And that is what makes this estate so different in the public imagination. It is not defined by size or spectacle, but by atmosphere. By the feeling it creates rather than the features it displays. It represents a version of life that exists away from cameras, away from events, and away from the constant expectation of visibility. For someone like Heart Evangelista, whose public life is built on image, influence, and constant observation, this space represents the opposite of that world. It is where control becomes personal rather than public, where luxury is not performed, but experienced, where silence is not empty, but full. And that contrast is what makes the Tagaytay estate so compelling in her story. Because it shows that even within a life defined by global attention, there are spaces that exist for no one else to interpret, no one else to critique, and no one else to define. Spaces that are simply lived in. So while the world continues to know her for fashion, fame, and visibility, this side of her life reflects something more grounded. Something rooted in privacy, intention, and peace. And it is in that balance between two very different worlds that her story finds its depth. And that's the hidden side of Heart Evangelista most people never get to see. A life that moves between global luxury and quiet escapes in Tagaytay. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Her Status, and turn on notifications for more untold celebrity stories and exclusive lifestyle reveals you won't see anywhere else.